So we'll have about 40 or 45 minutes of Giles's talk, and then I hope there'll be plenty of time for questions. Thank you, Giles.
Thank you very much, Kate. I should start off with a confession. I probably, because of LSE, is about 5 minutes walk from here, the closest journey of anyone. I still managed to get lost and was almost late, but I'm delighted to be here. And I suppose my other confession is I'm an ESPA outsider, although I do admire your work programme and your research outputs tremendously, those that I've been able to see. But what I wanted to speak about this morning was essentially a different vantage point about the sustainability of development. So as Kate said, my own work has been on measuring sustainability largely by greening national accounts. Now, I've had links to some of the policy debates in the UK through membership of the Natural Capital Committee, along with Georgina Mace, somewhere in the audience, so I'm going to take my morning, Georgina, and also issues closer to ESPA hearts as well, hopefully with being a member of the advisory committee of the World Bank's Wealth Accounting for the valuation of ecosystem services, along with Paolo Nunes, who's also in the audience. So let me just set the context to begin with, to introduce my talk. So this greening the national accounts agenda, I'm not going to talk exclusively about that, hopefully breathe a sigh of relief there. But it has been an evolving field over the last 25 years or so. And increasingly, it's evolving to looking at natural capital accounting at its centre. And within that centrality, the crucial importance of ecosystem services and ecological capital. It's also, which I think shares some common ground with ESPA as well, it's an interdisciplinary research programme too. So there is natural science inputs. You need that in order to understand how you're going to construct meaningful accounts for things like ecosystem services. There are social scientists involved as well, although that tends to be a narrow pool of social scientists, economists, national accountants, so relatively narrow compared to the interdisciplinary focus of ESPA. It also tends to be a relatively technocratic exercise as well. So from this perspective, might look at these pictures on the left-hand side. You can just about make them out, marvel at nature for a moment, and then wonder, well, what's the stock value of that standing forest there from a national accounting perspective? And that national perspective is also something that's different as well. It's highly aggregated by definition. It's looking at what's happening at the nation. So it's very much more a top-down approach compared to the bottom-up perspective of much of your ESPA work. Maybe also, and I'll touch on this in a moment, maybe it's also premised on a different theory of development to those that many of you have been working with. It's certainly one which is more oriented towards theories of economic development and theories about the growth path of an economy. These statistics are then supposed to serve the purpose of testing those theories. But rather than emphasize those contrasts, the point of my talk this morning is that I think that there are important complementarities as well. And there's lots of scope for these different perspectives, this top-down national perspective and the ESPA perspective to learn from one another. And so that's the reason for my title to the talk, that I want to try and identify some possible extensions to ESPA work that draw on the sort of frameworks that myself and others have been using to look at these broader national level, regional level economic links. Now, I should stress that my claim isn't that this replaces an approach that seeks to understand what happens in and what works in more local contexts. So that's essentially the bedrock of good evidence, and it's also a safeguard against development plans based on misguided generalizations. So absolutely crucial. But what I want to try and argue is that there's a relevance to linking ESPA to those broader challenges too. And one example that I'd give to that, I think we all face, everybody working in this field of ecosystems and their impacts on human society. We face a credibility challenge with our claims relative to all the other claims that are being put to policymakers in demonstrating to those policymakers and others who either guide or influence policy levers, demonstrating to them the economic importance of ecosystem services, and not just the economic importance of ecosystem services, but also the scale of the economic development risk from losing those services. So I suppose my point is that these broader approaches can also help make that case as well. Okay, but the direction of travel is not just how ESPA, say, may extend what it's doing by looking to these broader approaches. I think it works both ways. I think there are crucial insights, well, lots of crucial insights that emerge from your work programme that really confront these perspectives at the national level with an interesting and possibly daunting challenge, and that's to be more sensitive to distributional concerns in, say, the sort of work that I do in constructing largely top-down national measures of sustainability. So I want to sort of conclude on that note about what my field can learn from ESPA as well. Okay, let me start by just outlining briefly the theory and practice of the perspective of sustainability that I come from. Then I'll try and move on to make the case that there's relevance of these broader approaches to ESPA itself. So I start with the basic theory. So this says that the future prospects of some entity, now typically this is a country, but it doesn't have to be, depends on its wealth. Why is that important? Well, wealth is like a stock which tells you something about how much you can consume, enjoy in terms of well-being in the future. Now, this wealth and these future prospects are determined by many things, but fundamentally they're determined by the assets that a country has, including its natural capital. So we can think of that well-being as being a return on those assets, in effect. Now, this is not a new idea, far from it, and with natural capital incorporated in the story, it goes back about 40 years or so. But contemporary setting, there's a focus more and more on different types of natural capital. There may be also the relationships between those natural assets as well. Distinction between tangible and intangible assets, so intangible being assets which don't necessarily have an obvious physical dimension. That could be elements of nature's services, but it could also be the sorts of cultural and social resources that are so integral as well to a lot of your ESPA work. So let me cut to the chase. So there's a relatively refined version of this theory that exists now. It's been evolving through time that provides us with some guidance as to what we might expect if these assets are used unsustainably. So what it says is that if you're using your assets unsustainably, you're passing on too few assets to the future, wealth and well-being might decline. So the emphasis is on might because this is the future, it's uncertain, but you may need, for example, some sort of technological change to remedy the situation if you are decreasing your wealth over time. Okay, these recent developments in theory have been closely linked, so really worked in parallel with developments with regards to measurement. And as I've mentioned, a lot of this has been linked to how nations construct their accounts as well. This is logical. There's logical links here to the sort of way of thinking about sustainability in this theory to the ways that national accountants measure income and product in an economy, and the way in which they construct balance sheets of the stocks of assets that an economy holds. Now, it's a narrow measure, so part of the challenge is then to extend that framework, but the basic building blocks are there. And you can see these extensions, this work, in official work programs undertaken by, for example, the national statistical agencies, but also international processes as well, the United Nations Statistical Office, but also the World Bank in its WAVES work as well, in guiding and shaping that work as time moves on. I should just footnote the rest of this slide, that this is not all about necessarily putting this into an accounting framework. Of course, there is a broader sustainability indicators movement into which this all fits as well. So ecological footprints, measures of appropriation of net primary production, etc. Some of these might be linked as well to official efforts to construct indicators. So presumably the Sustainable Development Goals are going to rely on a mix of diverse economic, social, environmental indicators, just as the Commission for Sustainable Development did in the early mid-1990s. Okay, just a few more words then on the approach. So to date, this approach has resulted in relatively highly aggregated indicators. So, for example, on the left-hand side of this slide, if you can make it out, there's some illustrations of an indicator the World Bank publishes each year. This is partly based on work that David Pearce, myself and Kirk Hamilton did in the early mid-1990s, that Kirk Hamilton then took on and extended at the World Bank. But essentially what this does is, for example, look at how much countries are saving for the future, how much overall assets they're passing on to the future, taking into account adjusting for depletion and degradation of natural capital. So the idea is to try to construct a more complete, comprehensive picture of what assets countries are passing on to future generations. Okay, how complete and comprehensive is this picture on the left-hand side? Well, the honest answer is that it's still work in progress. So, for example, how much in those lines there indicating how much countries on average in Latin America and Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa are saving on average as a proportion of their gross national income. How much of that is reflecting what's happening to ecological capital? The answer actually is very little at the moment. Routinely, this is still work in progress, and certainly this is something where this literature, this work program can learn a lot from what you're finding out in ESPA. And this is essentially what these official work programs by United Nations, statistical offices and so on are endeavouring to do. Now, there are some examples of work which then does try to go down this path and try to enrich this sort of national perspective with what's happening to ecological capital. So here's an example for a book that Kirk Hamilton and I authored a few years ago, looking at ecosystem services lost from deforestation in Peru and putting that into an accounting framework and seeing, well, how does the picture of Peru's development change as a result of making those adjustments. And there's also Ed Barbier's famous work on the economic losses of mangroves in Thailand that recently he's put in an accounting framework to illustrate that over the period 1970 to 2009, Thailand income was reduced by around about 1.5% of GDP as a result of the cumulative losses of those mangrove resources. Now, it might be natural to conclude that all of this seems a long way from much ESPA work. It's a high level of aggregation, as has been mentioned. Partly, that's not an inevitable consequence of using this framework. It's purely the particular question which is being asked. Are national economies sustainable? So I'll come back to this point in a moment, but what I want to focus on in the next slide is another possible troubling issue, and that's that perhaps the development theory that this sort of work is based on is at odds with the development theory or theories that may be used in ESPA. But what I want to suggest is that there's also some interesting parallels as well. So let me illustrate what I mean by this. Get the slide to change. I'm going to use an example here from, again, some World Bank work on national wealth accounting. But I want to illustrate that with a recent excellent paper from an ESPA project by Neil Dawson and Adrian Martin, I think published in Ecological Economics. So this looks at well-being and ecosystems in Western Rwanda. And what Dawson and Martin do is distinguish between what a person has in terms of their assets, so the assets that they own or can make use of, and the outcomes that that person can achieve. So what that person can do in terms of actually producing well-being. Now, this in turn draws on McGregor et al. And emphasises things like the crucial role that social and cultural resources might play in then mediating that process of using assets to achieving well-being. But what I want to try and show here is that these ideas do actually have some counterpart in these national perspectives on sustainability as well. So this is where this World Bank example hopefully illustrates this. So what the World Bank does is every few years measures national wealth across different countries, so essentially constructs balance sheets for nations, including the natural capital that these countries possess. It looks at two different things. It looks at the outcomes, so it defines wealth as the future per capita consumption possibilities that the average person in that country has. Now, in principle, these consumption possibilities should be equivalent to the assets that you have. So essentially, the wealth that you have is essentially the future value of the consumption that you can enjoy. How much consumption you can enjoy in the future must to some degree depend on the assets that you currently have and can utilize. So taking that logic, what the World Bank does then is estimate the outcome, those future consumption possibilities. So what it does, to use the terminology, estimates the present value of future consumption. Then it deducts from that total. So you'll see that total through Rwanda and the United Kingdom. I'll mention why I put the UK in here in one moment. Total wealth, which is, as I've said, the present value of future consumption, and then deduct from that a series of tangible assets that these countries possess. So this might be produced capital, so machines, buildings, physical infrastructure, natural capital, subsoil assets, forests, protected areas, other types of green space as well. Net foreign assets, how much you owe as a country to the rest of the world. And the interesting thing here that if you do that calculation, estimate what are the consumption possibilities in a particular country, deduct from that, well, what's the value of the assets that that economy holds, you end up with a residual there. Perhaps scratching our heads about what that residual might mean. So in Rwanda, that residual is 38% of its wealth is not explained by the produced capital, the natural capital, and the net foreign assets that the country holds. In the United Kingdom, it's over 86% of that wealth, not explained by those tangible assets. So what's going on here? Well, one explanation might be, well, there's other tangible assets that aren't being accounted for here. So this is where the UK example comes in, because there's an estimate here then of human capital. So human capital is not accounted for explicitly in those World Bank numbers, but if you were to account for that capital, then the residual value for the United Kingdom then shrinks, but it's still significant. It's still 26% of wealth is unexplained by the human capital, the natural capital, and the produced capital net foreign assets that the United Kingdom possesses. There may also be other elements of natural capital that aren't measured in that natural capital item as well. So that's going to end up in the residual as well. So there's an agenda there to better account in that respect as well. But where I want to draw this link, say, for example, to the Dawson and Martin paper, is that this large residual, I think, emphasises points which are made extremely well in that paper too. So essentially, it's the importance of intangible assets. So just as this is important to explaining individuals' well-being, it also seems to resonate strongly in the results that you get at the national level as well. So if all well-being was explained simply by the tangible assets that countries held, then we shouldn't have essentially a residual to explain. As it is, we've got this large residual, which arguably then is reflecting essentially the cultural and the social assets that a country has. So just to explain it in another way, somehow these countries are generating more consumption possibilities than a simple inspection of the tangible assets that they hold would indicate. And one answer to why that is, well, social, cultural assets are just as important looking at this national scale as they are to explaining well-being at the individual level as well. Now, the Dawson and Martin paper also has a richer and better story about well-being too, based on needs and beyond and subjective assessments of well-being. Now, it would be possible to make that part of this story at the national level as well. We don't tend to, but we could, and actually we probably should more in this literature, in this work programme than people like myself currently do. Okay, so my point here is that perhaps there's not such wildly divergent theories of development being suggested as at face value we might see. So the sorts of theories that you may be working with, the sorts of theories that might operate at this national level as well, may not be at such odds with one another as we might think. Now, clearly the spatial focus is very different, though. This is highly aggregated. It's at the national level. Of course, you're going to lose insights by that relatively high level of aggregation. But I'll come back to the point that it's not inevitable that you need to do this work at the national level, just to take advantage of that national accounting framework. Now, it's useful as a coherent and consistent framework for organising data. So that emphasis on how to organise ideas, data on stocks and flows in an economy, whether that's in a locality or at the regional or the national level. So it's valuable. It's valuable, for example, replicating and updating information for routine applications as well. So putting it into an accounting framework, then others can understand how you've used their data and apply it to their own settings, their own policy questions as well. So it's actually sometimes also asked that, given this provision of a powerful organising framework for making clear the importance of nature in the environment, will it be accountants to save the world? I think the answer is no to that. But their frameworks are really useful nonetheless. And as I say, this usefulness doesn't apply to or require using this at the national level. So Michael Varden, for example, used to work at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. He makes a really nice point about scale here. So his point is that often the spatial scales that we often work with regards to ecosystem assessments can be too small to influence policy actions. But by the same token, or at least by opposite token, these national accounting perspectives in many cases can be too highly aggregated as well to be useful for advising on policies with regards to ecosystems. So there is plenty of scope for thinking about what is the balance between that national and that local perspective. Is it a regional account? You know, in which case, at what sort of scale? You can see some of these arguments playing out as well in the way different organisational units have tried to apply these ideas. So there's current upsurge of interest in corporate national accounting, for example. However, there are some moments, I think, in which knowing what the problem is at the scale of the national economy or some broader perspective is very useful. So let me illustrate that with two ESPA papers by Mark Hudson. Mark Hudson in the audience? Is that okay? But a couple of papers that look at the extent of mangrove in coastal Kenya and the possible values of the resource. And I think this provides an illustration of that. So what I did was, maybe I shouldn't have done this, but just did a quick and dirty aggregation of the numbers which were in that paper. And the cumulative losses of those mangroves from 1985 through to 2010 actually seem on a par with the Ed Barbier numbers on Thailand and its mangroves in comparison to the scale of the national economy. So there's a significant loss of income. Thinking about those local numbers nationally, that I think actually is a useful additional insight for that sort of work, as interesting as it is already. Okay, I don't think those broader insights stop there. So let me continue in this vein, and then in the last part of the talk, I just want to come back to the distributional point, because I think that's where this literature can really, or my literature can really learn a lot. Okay, so let me then just make some points just generally about ecosystems in supporting economic development and economic growth. So here I'm not talking about ecosystems fueling or us fueling economic growth by liquidating ecological capital. You might get growth from that, but it's likely to be unsustainable. But what might we expect as the main growth benefits of sustainable flows of ecosystems, or what might we expect the additional growth benefit to be of investing in those ecosystem services? So we might first start by, for example, looking at growth processes in the abstract, and this we might characterize as a process of asset accumulation. So it's essentially that standard national sustainability story I told a few slides earlier. You could add to that as well, and importantly, we probably should, institutions as the social and cultural infrastructure for what is possible in an economy too. Most modern growth theories certainly do tend to emphasize that. But what's possible as well is also influenced by the technological frontier of an economy expanding as well. So what that influencing what you can achieve with your assets given the technology that is available to generate output and well-being. So let me just ask a couple of questions about what the role ecological capital might play in that process. It provides important services that support the economy, and on the next slide I'll give an example of that for nature tourism. But it also provides an important role in maintaining the productivity of other important assets in that economy as well. So here's an example to trace that link from loss of ecosystems to decreased economic growth. And this is just taken from two different papers from two LSE colleagues of mine, Eric Neumeier and his co-author Matthew Cole, and Tivrat Garg. Neumeier and Cole, what they find, for example, here is a negative and significant causal relationship between poor health, including the incidence of malaria in countries, and economic growth. So the argument is that countries with greater prevalence of malaria have lower growth rates. So this is a finding in some earlier papers as well. Now, of course, there's important questions about, well, ultimately, what are the social and economic processes which explain that disease burden? But it also seems that losses of ecosystem services play their part as well. And this is where the Garg paper comes in with an interesting insight. So Garg's paper finds a causal link from deforestation to malaria incidents in, his example is in Indonesia. So in fact, what he finds is up to 1.3 million additional infected individuals resulted from deforestation rates in Indonesia over an 8-year period from 2001 to 2008. So Garg estimates in turn that that could have health costs of round about, if we put it in terms of per hectare of forest lost, round about $200 or more of lost forest. Now, of course, you could put that into a cost-benefit perspective and weigh that against the benefits of losing that forest. But it also seems that there could be a more powerful dynamic going on as well, that link to economic growth from that positive statistical finding of the way in which malaria incidence in this example then decreases economic growth in countries. Okay, what about ecosystems, services in themselves? So I want to provide an example here which looks at an investment in ecosystem services, or an investment in a sector which would hopefully have the benefit of enhancing ecosystem services, and just explain briefly how that might affect the economy in actually quite intricate ways. And it would be interesting to find out more routinely how general that is for different types of ecosystem service interventions. So if we were thinking about how to appraise a large-scale investment in ecosystem services, clearly we would be interested in its role in alleviating poverty. So that should be guiding our judgment about what the worth of the investment might be. If we can value some of the benefits of that investment too, perhaps we could sit side by side with that, some sort of cost-benefit appraisal too. But if it's a large investment, so if it's really sort of scaling up the provision of an ecosystem services or a sector that provides those services in some relatively large way, we should be interested in impacts elsewhere in the economy too. So we should be looking at these linkages. What might these linkages be? Well, they could be backward linkages, for example. So backward linkages for this nature tourism example. This could be demand for outputs from other sectors to use as inputs in your investment. So presumably investing in the nature tourism sector involves building lodges to accommodate visitors. That increases the demand for inputs from the construction sector, from the transport sector in terms of needing things like access roads and so on. Now there could be also forward linkages as well that we might be interested in too. So perhaps our investment provides things which are used as inputs by other sectors. So scaling up investments in food provisioning services provided by ecosystems. Perhaps that might have forward linkages in processing activities, food processing activities downstream. Now, another important point here is that there's direct effects and there's also indirect effects of this sort of investment. So the direct effects are where a sector, so our nature tourism sector, directly buys inputs from another sector. So inputs from the construction sector in order to build these lodges to accommodate visitors. But importantly, that also triggers demand for inputs from other activities as well. So there's a whole chain of events, essentially, that we might be interested in as well, that ripple through the economy as a result of this particular investment. So here's an example for nature tourism in Zambia from a paper by Hamilton and Pavy from 2010. So essentially, the key message of that paper is that they identify substantial economic opportunities from developing this sector. The particular finding is that each nature tourist spends about $1,100 on average per visit. But importantly, that's the direct effect. So that's how much directly each tourist injects into the economy in Zambia as a result of their nature tourist visit. There's lots of other sectors then that benefit from that injection, that spending as well. So those are the indirect effects. So what's the impact of that? So essentially, those $1,100 spent directly then has a subsequent indirect impact such that the total impact of getting an extra visitor in the country doing nature tourism is a benefit of $2,300 to the economy. So more than twice the benefit that we might measure if we only looked at those direct impacts alone. And this is the sort of thing that, well, there may be, let me just conclude, there may be other important linkages as well. So perhaps what the project does is also build in give us foreign exchange, so relieve a particular development constraint there as well. Now, we should put all this in context because, maybe our investment in an ecosystem service, maybe it's in an enclave in the sense that it doesn't have these linkages. Does that make it a bad investment? And I think the argument would be, well, no, it doesn't necessarily. Perhaps it relieves poverty in an area that otherwise doesn't have these links that benefit from investments elsewhere or here in the particular region. But perhaps also going down this route of looking at these linkages also encourages us to think about types of interventions that may foster these links between different parts of the economy as well. Now, I think this is important, this particular perspective that this analysis offers, because it comes from the same greening national accounts framework as those national perspectives that I explained at the beginning. And it's often those sort of broad wealth numbers, greening GDP, that gets the headlines. But it's actually the more interesting policy and practical work is from this sort of detailed analysis such as Hamilton and Pavy have done. So it'd be interesting to know more generally what are the linkages to the rest of the economy of investing in various different ecosystem services. In the same way that there is a sophisticated discussion in other literatures and policy venues, so for example, the greenhouse gases, embodied carbon in trade, the way in which pollution and energy use is analysed in the industrial ecology literature. I think the challenges are greater for ecosystems, but it's not impossible to do this either, and to look at the ways in which investments, changes in ecosystem services then ripple through the economy using the sorts of accounting frameworks that this more national level work is beginning to offer. I think also it provides us with an interesting answer, an empirical answer to the question as to, well, why are ecosystem services important? Well, because they underpin everything. With this sort of framework, you can start to see, well, what exactly is it that they underpin? Those indirect impacts that otherwise may be invisible to the sorts of analysis that we often use. Okay, there's a link here. Paolo would have talked about his fascinating UNEP project in detail yesterday. So I'll just mention it as there is a link here too, to thinking about an opportunity in these broader perspectives to possibly influencing the development plans of nations. So this certainly could be important if you can establish in those plans about protecting and investing in ecosystem services as a balanced strategy for development that a nation can take. Now, that mainstreaming isn't necessarily straightforward. There's one example might be Natural Capital Committee in the United Kingdom. One of its proposals was, for example, to incorporate natural capital in the United Kingdom's infrastructure plan. So the idea was that if the government was serious about protecting natural capital, was serious about its role as a network of assets in supporting the economy and well-being, then its investment, its protection should be planned alongside other assets, physical infrastructure plans as well elsewhere in the economy. Now, the UK government decided against that recommendation, so sort of an illustrate there as to what the challenge is trying to mainstream some of these ideas, although I should add that the UK government also proceeding with a separate environmental plan with natural capital as a key element of it as well. So influencing these development plans is a challenge, but clearly it's an opportunity too. So if influencing policy thinking at the national level potentially makes a significant difference, then it definitely seems worth exploring those possibilities. But I want to just finish the presentation with a couple of slides which I hope make the point that influence is probably only worth having, or arguably only worth having, on certain terms. So clearly a strength of ESPA is at its heart you have this distributional perspective on ecosystem services. So that's a key goal, and I think it's not just important to make these plans reflect ecosystem services and investing in those ecosystem services as part of a balanced strategy, but also to emphasize investing in those services as a way of addressing distributional concerns and making the sorts of metrics that we use at the national level more sensitive to these distributional outcomes and processes as well. That's a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that'd be worth confronting those national approaches with to see if they can react to it. How am I doing for time, Kate? Is that? Yeah, so just 5 minutes then on the, and then concluding. So I'll just say that this is largely a neglected area in the framework that I elaborated earlier. So it focuses on the national level. You may have noticed I use the term per capita prospects in some of my phrasing. So it's looking at what's happening to people on average. So clearly, looking at what's happening on average disguises a lot of the distributional story. There is a sense in which there are some insights starting to emerge from this literature on natural capital accounting, but it tends to be for quite a narrow range of natural assets, particularly what's happening to subsoil assets. Are they being taxed by government, or are the profits, the excess profits, the rents from those activities being allowed to be kept with private companies, multinational corporations, and then repatriated abroad, for example? Are the rents from exploiting those resources being used by government to subsidise fuel bills, as they were in Iran up to 2010, for example? So that has distributional consequences as well. Maybe not altogether those that help the very poorest in society, given presumably it benefits people who have relatively high car ownership and so on. There are some attempts at general theories as well. So Ed Barbier very recently has published a book where he traces the historical undervaluation of natural capital to some of the trends in global inequality that we see now. So his argument is that essentially overly cheap or deceptively cheap natural capital, because we don't value it sufficiently explicitly, has set up institutional perspectives to neglect investing in other assets, notably human capital, and that's created wage disparities and inequalities that we live with now. This is certainly, I think, an area of work where ESPA could play an important part in confronting these national perspectives, as I say, with what they can deliver on those messages. So these national perspectives, I think, are useful in a number of ways, but there is a risk, of course, that the very voices of some of the people of which you are most concerned don't get prioritised or are lost somehow in the aggregation that these national perspectives take. So I think the answer is not necessarily to walk away and abandon those national perspectives, but to try to ensure and be vigilant that they are sensitive to those concerns. If they can't confront that challenge, well, then think about perhaps walking away. Okay, last slide and then some conclusions. This is just to make the point that actually some of this literature can, from this economic modelling perspective, can make these points already. So this is just some more results from the Hamilton and Pavy paper. So they do look at some of the distributional consequences of investing in nature tourism in Zambia, the impacts on investment, so the total effect, the direct and indirect. Free nature tourists generates 1 full-time job. There are important fiscal linkages whereby this investment raises government revenues, which presumably can be spent in different ways. But also there's an interesting result with regards to poverty alleviation as well. So there's not much evidence was found in this study that revenues were shared amongst communities from fees, access fees and so on, the communities that live near or in these management areas. So there apparently is very little evidence that those benefits of this sort of investment will spontaneously, naturally trickle down to those people living in those areas. Now, the economic development literature would call that a low poverty elasticity. So I guess you would probably call it more an example of weak governance of the game management area and perhaps elite capture of those revenues. But I think the important point is that this approach can also get some of those insights as well if it doesn't necessarily have then the explanations in terms of, say, that terminology I just used as to what's really driving that process. But I think an important policy message that, say, in this example, then that would need special attention. It won't necessarily happen spontaneously as a result of this scaled-up investment in nature tourism. Okay, so some conclusions. Concluding remarks, if I may. So my main concern really then has been in tying together bits of what might be characterised as a rather top-down approach to thinking about the sustainability of development, to the rather more, if I'm characterising it fairly, bottom-up approaches of ESPA projects. Now, bottom-up approaches certainly feel like the right way to do things, as I mentioned right at the beginning. But I think that the wider context can throw light on important further questions as well. So to what extent does economic development rely indirectly on ecosystem services, given the dependencies of some sectors on one another? What are the linkages, if we're investing in ecosystem services, between where we're making that investment and what's going to happen elsewhere in the economy? But as I mentioned, I think these broader approaches can learn a lot from ESPA too. So it works both ways. I think in order to legitimise the work that's being done at that national level, I think it'd be certainly important for ESPA work to influence the way in which it engages with distributional issues in the context of ecosystem services. Thank you. I'll leave it there and hope I didn't go over too much on the time. Thanks.
Right, we have a few minutes for questions, and I just want to say thank you so much to Giles for a very thoughtful and I think very thought-provoking presentation. We've long debated actually what sort of economics we have and what sort of economics we need in ESPA. And I think that your talk really did focus our ideas around that. And it gives us a great opportunity to reflect on how our ESPA research really speaks to some of these national level accounting initiatives and relates to some of these international measures of sustainable development and so on. I also think it really gives us ideas about how our research, I suppose, can inform and how, again, it might speak to the sort of mainstreaming initiatives around natural capital. And ultimately, really, how can ecosystem services fuel economic growth? How does that in turn relate to poverty alleviation? And I think especially these issues that you raised around distribution, around different dimensions of well-being and sort of different social actors' access to the benefits of natural capital are at the core of ESPA. So thank you. Right, any questions? We've got about 5 minutes for questions. Right, I'm going to bring a microphone, and if I could ask you please to use the mic and say your name so that anybody that's watching this on the internet.
Thanks, Kate. Steve Bass, IID. Thank you very much, Giles. In terms of your question, Kate, how might ESPA speak to the accounting community? I mean, I think it's probably right to think that ESPA scientists have come up with much more nuanced notions of what is natural capital, particularly those parts that aren't measured in the formal accounts. So exploring more of the intangible residual. I think we've also got something to say on the social capital that realizes natural capital effectively, and also well-being. I mean, many scientists have further developed the well-being framework. So in terms of what capital is, we have more to say. In terms of how your community speaks to ESPA scientists, I mean, I'm quite attracted by the idea that organizing knowledge in a kind of accounting framework could help with our impact. I mean, I'm aware that many decisions are made on the basis of account sheets, or at least an account-type thinking. So, rather simple idea, but those of us who want to make impact, how should we organize our findings a little bit better to make a kind of a leap towards the people who do think in terms of balance sheets? Maybe some kind of guide from all of you. Third point, mainstreaming ecosystem services into national development plans. I mean, I think our experience is, you're right, that it is too aggregated. I'm working with 8 African countries in terms of mainstreaming biodiversity. All of them think that the national plan level is highly resistant to sort of biodiversity as such. Each of these 8 countries have chosen big, hot development issues which are locally placed and have strong distributional issues. So spatial distributional hot issues seem to attract more demand for information about biodiversity and ecosystems than the kind of bland national plan where you just put words in. Anyway, so 3 thoughts. We do need our communities to come a bit closer together, so that if you did this in a year's time, it wouldn't go quite over everyone's heads, perhaps as it might have done. You've begun to make the link, though. Thanks.
Giles, do you have a response to?
No, well, I need to say thank you for those those comments. No, I think it's interesting to ask to what extent does trying to affect those national plans, given that they, if they are important focal documents, it would be useful, I would think, to sort of test how they can be made more sensitive to the sorts of insights that you get. I mean, if they can't, then in a sense, all the poorer for them. But yeah.
Giles, thank you very much for your nice presentation. I'm Manoj Roy from Lancaster University. I was quite drawn by your table that put together Rwanda and United Kingdom, where I was kind of feeling a little bit of there exists a paradox, or if you could explain a little bit. What I felt that the wealth, and when you discount this one, the percentage of the natural capital seems to be quite high in Rwanda compared to the UK. Mm-hmm. And if you go down, when you have shown the human capital seems to be quite high in UK compared to Rwanda. So does this mean 2 things? One is that whether the ESPA science needs to be looking into those countries, Rwanda, or less developed world, where the natural capital's contribution to the future is quite high compared to the UK. But also, does it mean that there is a paradox in the sense that to become a wealthy country like UK, where you need to spend quite a lot on human capital, and that's the contribution of the human capital is substantially higher compared to the others. So I was just thinking whether there is a connections between the natural capital's contribution versus human capital contribution within country, and the country's overall leap forward to the prosperity.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I think most of the economic growth literature points to the centrality of human capital investments as part of the engine of growth, or at least allowing sort of technological developments then to be realised. But I think the important point about the ecosystems insight is that just the exclusive focus on that then loses insights about you might want a more balanced strategy that involves ecological capital as well. So I think that nature tourism example in Zambia illustrates that. The Ed Barbier theory of the possible link to inequality, seems to exemplify that as well. With regards to the importance of natural capital, say in the UK, I mean, I should stress that of course how I couched those numbers was the shares of the total rather than the value. So the values are actually sort of high in absolute dollar terms. So it doesn't necessarily say that the value of that natural capital that the UK has is low. It doesn't necessarily say anything, I think, in particular about what a particular development path should be. So I think certainly we should be careful about that, about saying that there's some development path that countries then all have to follow, and certainly, a strong message from Natural Capital Committee that Georgina and myself were members of was, well, you would get a kind of better balance of wealth and well-being if we were to invest actually more strongly in natural capital here.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question.
Thank you, Giles, for the comprehensive, rich presentation you made. I have more a question to you in terms of, I agree with you that two communities, on one hand, what we call the ESPA community, micro-based community, and the macro aggregate community have much to learn one each other. I'd like to ask you how effective this learning can be or is being at the moment, because if the communication is not established from moment zero, most probably it's a potential benefit from communicator, but effectively is not producing anything de facto.
How effective is what, Paolo?
Effectively is not producing.
But I missed the publication that you mentioned.
No, not the publication. De facto, there is no link because they're not communicating. For example, from a methodological viewpoint, if you start from a broader perspective and to go to the micro perspective, and you have that in head beforehand, most probably the toolbox that you're going to use is going to be different if you just stop at the broader level. The same way from the micro level. So one story short, how effective this potential of communication is de facto, if from the methodological viewpoint there is a vacuum. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I imagine you must experience this at UNEP as well, that this is perhaps strategically where trying to influence these plans comes in, because if you look at what the accounting work being done in these international statistical processes, they seem to have a sort of a good handle on how the ecosystem services might be accounted for, realize that you need to do that on a spatially rich level, are wrestling with how to do that, and with the ways of working, communities of practice, as Steve calls it, that they belong to, but they are aware of it. What they don't then have is that, and what will be missing from what's being done is this distributional story, the distributional sensitivity, and that's where I think maybe this national plan thing comes in, because if you can influence that to make that story sensitive to those distributional concerns, then you have a focal point for saying, why do our measurement, our metrics, our accounting frameworks not then reflect what's in that plan? And so I think you've got sort of, well, in that case, a kind of a trio of sort of possible institutions interacting with one another.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we'll have to finish the discussion of Giles's talk now, but I think that this has raised so many really important issues. And actually what it's kind of highlighted for me and made me reflect on is how within the sort of ESPA community we've developed a kind of language and a way of talking to each other, and that it's highlighted that we also need to kind of maybe reframe some of our kind of language and assumptions, because as soon as we come up and try to talk to another community, we realize that actually we're using some specialized language. And so actually finding ways of talking to across these different policy and science communities is absolutely key, and we'll discuss that a bit more today. We need to move on. I'd like to say thank you again to Giles for a great talk. And I'm sure you can catch up with Giles in the coffee break, which will be in approximately 25 minutes for anybody who's in need of caffeine. But we now have a short talk of about 20 minutes. And I will introduce, whilst Rick is just moving up to the front here, Rick Stuart, who is from the Environment, Information and Data Centre. Rick's based at the University of Lancaster, and Rick's going to give a short presentation which I'm sure will generate a number of questions and queries around how we can plan for the use and the reuse of our data. And I think this comes at a really, really timely kind of spot in the development of the ESPA programme. And I think that these are absolutely critical issues which we should consider both as we design our research, but even more so now as we're starting to produce different forms of output, and for us to start thinking about the value of our data, but also our data and our data sets as shared outputs. So, Rick, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to come along and talk to you today. As Kate was saying, it's about planning for the use and reuse of those valuable data sets. Now, relatively, you know, you've been listening to a lot of really interesting science, and I've looked at all the posters, they're great. And I imagine this talk is, you know, not quite as interesting as the other scientific talks, but however, as Katie was saying, you know, the data underpins all of your science, and it is, you know, more regarded as an output now than it has been in the past. I've got some quite simple but important messages about planning for that use and reuse of those data. What I do have to say, although I'm from the NERC Environmental Information Data Centre, most of what I'm going to say is actually quite generic. And as I say, they're quite simple but important messages. Word of warning, I will mention data management plans in slide 8, so just so you're ready for that. You don't need me to tell you how, you know, valuable data are, how much effort goes into collecting them. In my previous life as a researcher, I spent many years crawling around in bracken trying to observe rare butterflies and contracted Lyme disease in doing so. So I know that data are very valuable. Most of them are unrepeatable. If they are, it's very costly. So there's a huge amount of effort and time invested in collecting them. Obviously, funders know that as well. And most of the funders have now, you know, themselves have an obligation to ensure that the money that goes into the research is best used. And data are increasingly, you know, known as a valuable resource. And so therefore the funders themselves have an obligation to ensure that the data that are outputs of these scientific research are best used. In the past, that was maybe a bit one-sided, but actually what I'm hoping to demonstrate to you today is there are real benefits in doing that for yourselves as the researchers who are authoring and creating those data sets. So as one of the funders, NERC has a policy basically around its one of those obligations to ensure that any data generated are best managed or well managed and are made available to ensure their long-term reusability. In doing so, it also funds national data centres which act as repositories for specific types of data. And that's partly our role. We are one of those NERC data centres and we oversee the guidance and support to you guys in terms of what you do with your data and how you plan to make it reusable in the future, or the things that you need to take into account in doing that. Plus also we act as one of those long-term repositories as well. So we have a formal role in overseeing the data use within the programme. And I'll come on to the mechanism of how we do that. As I say, we're one of the NERC data centres. There is another 6 or 7, and they're generally sort of divided up in terms of sort of disciplines. Now, obviously, within there, that's mostly social science, so natural sciences. What our overseeing role is to make sure that people make the best plans for the data. So if you're involved with social sciences as well, and you've got social sciences type data, clearly it's not going to go to one of those repositories. It's going to go to a repository like the UK Data Archive, based in Essex, who are specialists in social science type data. Genomic data doesn't come to one of these either. So we just oversee what the best plan is. It doesn't mean it has to come to one of these data centres, but these are in existence to promote the reuse and long-term security or access to those types of data. So that's us, the Environmental Information Data Centre. We look after sort of terrestrial freshwater and hydrological data. Support and guidance, long-term data curation are 2 sort of main roles. So one of the main things to kind of remember then is that there are expectations on you guys as researchers. And I've mentioned about the funders. NERC has a data policy, ESRC has a data policy, DEFRA has a data policy. They all have data policies. So the important thing is to understand is, well, what is the obligation on you as a researcher in receipt of that funding, and what do you need to do? The best thing to do is to make sure you're aware of that early on rather than last minute when it comes to publishing. So really that's what this talk is about. It's about planning. It's about planning to make sure you know what your obligations are, you know what you're trying to do, and you sort of mitigate the risk of them not happening. So there is also legislation. Certainly in the UK, there's legislation that affects what you do with data, how you can make it available, or that you have to make it available depending on the funding. But obviously in other countries as well, there's both legislation and also maybe there may be policies around maybe platforms that you're using. Say in Amazon, it may be a policy around that platform that you have to deposit data into a certain repository within that country. Now that's okay. What as I say, you need to do is to make sure people are aware of those obligations quite early on, because it may mean you want to do things that make it easier in the long term to meet those obligations rather than worry about it last minute and where things are actually going to take twice as long. So it's around establishing what those expectations on you are. Increasingly, publishers, scientific publishers are wanting to, or requiring, I should say, to have data sets accessible that underpin that science. And they usually do that by saying they want something called a digital object identifier. But mostly it's around saying you have to show how the data are made accessible through a long-term repository. But again, that's something you want to make sure you know about way in advance rather than last minute. So again, if you've got an idea of who you're going to be submitting to, look at their policy and see what they say about the data that underpins that science. So it's all around making sure you're aware of those expectations. It's really around audit trailing and data sharing. That's fairly generic, that's not restricted to NERC. It's a fairly generic approach. However, I would also say, well, just coming on to that, our job basically is to help you through that process, is to make your life a bit easier and get the benefits out of it. But I would say, there's an emphasis on data sharing, an emphasis on audit trail accessibility data. That may not always be appropriate. There's always going to be exceptions. I'm talking about things like sensitivity of data, so location information of rare species, things like that, or data that has people's names and addresses and easy ways of identifying them. Those are all exceptions, and there's a very good way of making sure you take those into account. So it's not a carte blanche, black and white, everything must be made accessible. It's around making sure there's a correct plan for what's going to happen. One of the NERC data policies I'm just going to quickly go through, and again, it doesn't apply to everyone because you may be getting funding from other people, but just to give you a flavour of what, if you're not getting the funding from NERC as well, just to kind of give you a flavour of what funders are increasingly kind of wanting in their policies. So basically, the NERC policy applies to anything that's either part funded or fully funded, and it basically says that all of the data generated in that research has to be offered to one of the NERC data centres, and that word offered just means we can decide, well, actually, we think it's okay to come to us, or we think it's maybe more appropriate to go to a different specialist data centre. So it's not necessarily that we are going to take it and that's it. It's going to be we're going to be offered it and we're going to look at the best place for it. All the data that we hold is made freely available. In other words, we don't restrict who can have it, providing they agree to the terms and conditions that are fairly generic. However, of course, NERC would support a sort of embargo period, i.e. around the first use of those data, because obviously it's not really in everyone's interest to say, right, as soon as you collect the data, it must be made publicly available so someone else can publish on it. So there's no fixed period for that. You know, it's never been challenged in law. There's no rules around that. So we will put an embargo in place. The important thing about that is that what it means is that there is a published plan for when it will be made available, and that could be in a year, it could be in 2 years. Now, if anyone challenges that, basically there is a planned approach. It's not that the data is being withheld. And that's what really the legislation around, certainly in the UK, data sharing is around having a plan for publishing. It doesn't mean it has to be made available straight away, it just means there needs to be a plan. Okay. And one of the mechanisms of doing that is a data management plan, and I'll come on to that. And again, mentioned about the publisher's statement in there somewhere that says how the data is accessible. Okay. Now, there are real benefits to doing that. I mean, obviously it sounds a bit, one-sided. You've got to give the data that you've generated away. But there are lots of benefits around doing that. Data sets are scientific outputs. So that helps to contribute to sort of things like key performance indicators and things like that. And that's outputs of the program. It's a lot easier now to get persistent credit for those data sets that you've authored. In the past, there wasn't really a way of doing it, but with DOIs, which I'll come on to, digital object identifiers, I'll show you how that works, which does mean that your information around that you as an author of that data set can be credited, can be cited for the effort that you've put into that. It does also help the promotion of the research in general, in the wider sense of altruistically of that, there's more data available for research. But actually, in terms of, say, like the ESPA programme, all the things we do, we can include links to other research papers or the ESPA programme in general. So it's another conduit, if you like, for promotion of the science. The other thing, of course, is it means that you don't have to worry about it. In 10 years' time, you can go directly back to the data set that underpinned your science without having to worry about it. We'll always be looking after it. And because it's kind of international standards, it's very easy to make those metadata, etc., things that describe the data available around the world to other people without having to redo it all the time. So we also deal with all those kind of legal aspects as well. So if anyone contacts you about access to the data, you just give them the citation reference and that's it. You don't need to worry about it. So, there's a lot of less effort on your part in terms of worrying about the long-term security and access issues. Data management plans, I said I'd mention them. Usually the blood drains out of everyone's face at this point in time, but really what I want to try and do is just really show actually they're quite simple and straightforward and common sense, really. Effectively, all you're doing is looking at what you're planning to do with data and all of those issues around it. I mean, looking at the posters, there are issues around sharing data, there are issues around access to data. And one of the things, it's not moving, it is moving forward, you're generating data the lifetime of your program, okay? The main thing is, well, how are you going to document what those data mean? Because in 3-4 years' time, when you get to the analysis, and the researchers who were working with you 3-4 years ago have moved on to other things, will you understand how those data were generated, what the methodologies were, what the changes to those methodologies were, because what usually happens is that things don't ever stay the same. So just the documentation, and that's kind of something that you need to plan in because it won't happen otherwise. And of course, what quality do those data need to be? Who's going to sign them off? Who's going to say they do meet the kind of quality you need for your science? And no one can tell you what that is apart from yourselves. How is it going to be stored? What's the best way of storing it? And again, it may be that you need to take into account that you may have some sensitive information that you want to store slightly separately away from other data so you can make the other data available without compromising that sensitivity. Documentation around that, but also, how are you going to version control it? Who can do the updates? So all those kind of things just around general sort of quality of data. Importantly, though, who can access it within your project, outside of your project, within the program, and when will it be made available beyond the life of the project to the public? who, you know, what are the issues around that? And there's no hard and fast rules other than saying, think about it and make plans, because if you don't do it now, you don't want to do it at the end of the programme when you're trying to publish papers. And obviously during the programme as well, there may be issues around that as well. And again, you know, quality issues around, well, who can transform data and how do they go about doing that? Analysis of data, you know, how are you going to analyse it? What is required in terms of the data sets that go into analysis? How do they need to be transformed from the raw data? Is there an audit trail around that? So it's all just those kind of plans, really, to make sure they happen, which means that you can further down the line meet all those expectations. I mentioned before about publishing. Who are you going to publish to? What's their policy on access to data? What do you need to take into account? You're going to have to think about that in advance. And again, you know, what kind of quality information are they looking for in terms of how you've done your research? And then, of course, that's just to the end of your programme. What happens beyond the end of the grant? What happens at the end of the programme? How our data can be made available in the future? And that's where we come in, obviously. So those plans need to take into account, well, who are the authors? When should it be made public? Should it be embargoed? Should it be made public? Are there access issues around sensitivity? You know, is it going to come to EIDC? Is it going to come to one of the other data centres? So it's all those kind of issues that need to be planned in advance, because you don't want to be thinking about them last minute, because the people that need to think about them may not be around. It may need to go to the other data centres. What are their requirements? So this is all around just making those plans so that you actually meet those expectations. So really just that, the data management plan is just a plan of what you're going to do and how you're going to go about doing it to make sure that it actually happens. One thing I've put in there, but it's actually, I've just realised it's behind one of the images, is around that issue around policies and expectation. What are the things that you need to do at the end of your grant or within your grant to meet the expectations of maybe legislation or policy funders? Because that gives you something to aim for, okay? Some of the detail of that, I was just going to quickly go through. Any data that comes to us, probably like all the other data centres, obviously the main thing is to be secure and, you know, in terms of secure storage, and to make sure in 10 years' time you can access it and it will still work. It won't be in a format that's now obsolete. So we'll make sure that those data sets are in a format that's still reusable, and it won't have changed. We put things in place to make sure that the data doesn't get changed. And obviously that's the thing you'd expect from a long-term data centre. One of the other aspects to it as well is that we catalogue everything to an international standard, which means that catalogue information can be extracted out by other catalogues all around the world, so you can discover it in more places. So we have a metadata catalogue. Don't worry about the actual standard, but it just means it's more available to other people, which means you don't have to type it in twice. You don't have to. It means you don't have different information about the data sets held in different places. Just go back one. I mentioned about citation, about DOIs. What this means is that it's a mechanism for basically for referencing your data set, but also for always accessing the information about it. So the catalogue record I just showed, there's a mechanism to always be able to access that. So this is just someone's science paper, and within there is a bit of text that basically says the data will be allocated a DOI, and here's the dereferencing string. Now, there's no, as you see, it's just a whole load of numbers. So there's no one's network server name in there. There's no domain name. Basically, a dereferencing service, doi.org, paste in that number, and it will take you directly to the metadata record, because effectively that's what the guarantee is of a DOI. We have to maintain that link, regardless of what we do behind the scenes, or even if we get superseded by another organisation. That DOI must always take you back to the record. Okay? So it's an absolute guarantee that you can always find out information, and obviously within that information is things like who the authors are and how you access the data. So that's the mechanism for always accessing information, and that acts as a citation reference. And because it's a DOI, you can get metrics on how many times that DOI has been used. I would say that's an ongoing bit of development with Thomson Reuters and people like that to get those metrics, but it is starting to become one of those metrics that you can use in terms of how many times that data set's been cited. Okay, as mentioned, that's a guaranteed persistence, so in 10 years' time that will still work. I did mention about, you know, those metadata records are because they're based on an international standard, widely discoverable. So we put them out across the web via various catalogues. Things like data.gov, which is the national data catalogue, the NERC one, and even just things like, web servers, Google, etc., etc. So they're very easily discoverable. So again, it's just a way of promoting your profile, as it were. Obviously, we can put links in as well to other things. Now, again, you may need to consider that. Social sciences data that's been anonymised, linked to GIS data with locations of boreholes, probably not a good idea to link the two, because actually you may be compromising that anonymity. So there are issues, but again, those are things to just take into consideration. Making it usable, those documents are talked about, make sure they're deposited with us as well, and then people understand what the data is. Should it be made accessible? We'll put that on place regardless of, whenever we think, we've agreed with you when those data are going to be made available. It's a discussion around that issue. We don't just sort of say, right, you've got it, now we're going to make it public. Okay. So doing all those things basically means you can meet the funders' expectations, and that's the key thing really, is to make sure you plan those things in advance, or else they won't happen. And that's really, again, the main message really is just to make sure you've thought about all those things rather than not think about them and think, oh, yeah, there's a lot of issues around here, we'll not worry about them now. Because actually, there are things that are going to be easier to sort out early on. So in terms of, just ongoing work, I mean, obviously, you can't get all that information from the word go. So it's a case of developing that issue over time, that information over time. And our role is to kind of work with the NERC-funded researchers and provide guidance to anyone, really, about how best to go about doing that. And really what we'd say is start early and just try and add detail in as you go. Okay. I'll just quickly whip through. So in terms of next steps, really I would just reiterate, just think about it and start to make plans. Make sure someone within your research group is thinking about these things and is writing them down, because actually if things are not written down, they're unlikely to be remembered in 4 years' time. Certainly for the NERC-funded grants, we provide sort of liaison staff who will work more closely with you about, or establishing that communication link to do that. And I know most of you are already on with that, and some of the data management plans I've seen are great. They're really full of information that leads into all of those issues, and they really help set out what's going to happen in future. Nothing's set in stone at this point in time as well. It's all a development. It's all an ongoing kind of process, but think about it early. Okay, is there any questions? Sorry, I had a summary there, but I think I've just said it.
Thank you very much, Rick. That was a great talk. And are there any questions? I mean, there are some real challenges, I think, for our ESPA projects because of their, collaborative and international and interdisciplinary nature. I mean, one question that springs to mind is that different data sets produced from one project might well end up in different places, and if that's a problem. And also the whole issue about access and about whether or not once you get a DOI, is it then just, internationally open access?
Okay, well, I'll kind of deal with them. Yeah, I mean, definitely where there's multiple funders, where there's multiple interdisciplinary science, and where there's multiple countries where data are being generated, there's always going to be potentially what on the face of it will look like maybe even conflicting policies, but actually there's usually they're all wanting the same thing, and actually the best thing to be doing, as I say, is to plan out, well, how are we going to meet all of those policies in the best way? And our role is to help kind of get through that. The issue around DOIs, a DOI is issued for a data set that's deposited into a data center. That doesn't trump any issues around embargoes or things like that. So if it's agreed that, a period of time which NERC would support in terms of saying you should have first rights to write scientific publications on this, then having a DOI doesn't trump that at all. It just means that the information around access and around that data set is known, and that information would say this data set will be made available in 2 years' time. So it's around the access to that information. And then the other point about data sets being maybe, there's lots of different data sets interdisciplinary or maybe even stored in different data centers. I did show on one of the slides about the catalogue record where you can include online links to other data centers or other data sets or other citations. So as long as you've got those links, then you can just sort of hop between the different data centres. I mean, there are no hard and fast rules for a lot of it as well. We've got some social sciences type data because there's no issues around anonymity with it. We can make it available, and it's very closely linked with a lot of the natural sciences data. So sometimes it's easy to deposit the whole thing in one place. Maybe if it's different places, as long as you've got those cross links, then people can always find out about it as well.
Thank you very much. Right, I've got a question here.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful for people who work on natural resource management and various things. And I understand because of your international character of keeping the information is very enlightening, open access. You know, more you give, the better sort of approach. Now there is an alternative commercial world where the approach is not to give the data.
Yes, sure.
And you make money out of data. And you patent your whole, intellectual property right is full of patents, which basically means, give enough information, not enough information, anybody can do anything with it.
That's right.
So how those two extremes sort of talk to each other? Where is the line in between that where you make it obligatory to somebody to make sure?
I think maybe there's a distinction, and maybe that's something I should have drawn the distinction or highlighted more between raw data, environmental data, and an information product that's based upon more value added to the raw data that's collected. And certainly raw data is seen as the sort of data sharing area. Where things have been added value, where there's much more intellectual input into that, then those data sets are not covered in the same way in terms of the obligation to make them openly accessible and shared. And those are the kinds of data sets that can be made more commercially viable or restricted from access in those kind of ways. So it's around that difference between, the raw data and the added value data. And certainly NERC as a funder would draw that distinction for that very purpose. Now, that's because NERC is funded in the way it's funded. Other funders may have a different policy. So again, I think the key thing is to make sure you're aware of what the requirements are upon you from wherever the funding is coming from. But as I say, raw data is one kind of type of data. Value-added information products are another.
Thank you. I have a question about two scenarios, because in natural sciences there are lots of open access data for biophysical processes going in different regions of the world. Now, if I put together a data set using open access data sets from different sources, will that be considered a new data set that requires to be stored at a repository? That's one scenario. And secondly, if I, again, using secondary open access data sources, and I put together a new data set, and I make a calculation, and I just add one column with my results, will that be considered a new data set that requires being stored, or will it be enough for me just to describe the methodology in my paper and just go back to the original sources, and that will be enough? I don't need to store anything. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, derived data is another whole sort of area as well, because obviously it depends upon what the terms and conditions are of the reuse of those data that you're acquiring and reusing. And certainly some data sets come with all sorts of copyright, and if you try and reuse them, you have to go back to the originators of the original data and say, is this okay? Because it depends if they think their data is available by using yours. So the key thing is to understand or be aware of the requirements of the terms and conditions of the data sets you're using in the first place. That can have a big impact on how those data can be used. Certainly, if we were to take any data in, we would, in terms of data that's been generated, if it's been acquired and then you've done some extra work, if those data sets are available and you can just describe it in a methodology, then there probably isn't much point in taking another version of those data. But if you've transformed data and derived a data set that's unique in itself, that would take a lot of work to redo, then yes, we would term that as a data set that could come into the data center. But what we would need to know is, well, what are the arrangements or what are the conditions around us making that available? Because obviously we would need to know the information around the derived, you know, the acknowledgements, if you like, and what the terms and conditions are, so that we weren't contravening any licensing restrictions. You know, it just comes down to a balance of, well, if the data is available elsewhere and you've transformed a column and by this method, then maybe it isn't, you know, necessary to store that data again, because in terms of an audit trail, it's there. You know, here's the data and here's my method. And again, there's no hard and fast rules. It's kind of the situation at the time and what we would agree with you would be the best approach.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Do you have some examples of what is the best way to store qualitative data?
I didn't quite get the question, but was it around what do we do to around the quality of the data?
Thank you. It's about qualitative data, because when we think about data storage, we mainly think about databases with quantitative data or qualitative data that is quantified, but purely qualitative data.
Well, again, I mean, I think essentially the data centers, certainly our data center, is not that prescriptive in terms of the data sets, what, you know, their structure, you know, what's in them. We don't put it into a bigger pot, as it were. They come in as discrete entities amongst themselves. So in terms of the end product, we would just take anything, to be honest, because actually, you know, there's in some disciplines there are very rigid or very well described protocols, and all the data fits the same structure or the same format. But in our world, there isn't. So we would take any type of data in the structure and the format, as long as it's long-term format that is generated. Now, how those data are generated and how they're stored within the project, really, I would say is probably your remit in terms of how you would go about doing that. But certainly, we are there to help provide guidance around, you know, how you could do that. But we wouldn't prescribe anything. It's really around, you know, how you think best to store those data or to collect those data or to analyze those data. The end product is what we would take, and we will take anything in any shape or form as long as it meets that kind of long-term requirement for reuse.
Thank you. And I mean, I think the really, really important messages here are, firstly, that, you know, we do need to make sure that ESPA data are stored and archived and are made available in appropriate forms and in appropriate places. You know, partly, of course, to support and, you know, ensure the legacy of the ESPA program. But secondly, that actually the support and the advice and the help is there for, you know, the ESPA community to draw on. So, Rick, that's been very, very helpful. And I thank you for your presentation and show appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.